Over the last 3 weeks, a woman named Christine Wansley has had 4 jobs. She has worked as a search and rescue coordinator, calling a volunteer organization herself, mobilizing boats, and a drone because she felt the official response wasn't moving fast enough to find her son. She has worked as an amateur crime scene investigator, cross-checking timelines herself, questioning what didn't add up between witness statements and the GPS data, while waiting for answers that the authorities had not yet provided. She has worked as her own son's legal representative, going to court to be named administrator of his estate, so she wouldn't have the standing to act on his behalf, now that he no longer could. And she has worked as a digital forensics analyst, personally comparing location histories between 2 apps before any lawyer had even gotten involved, trying to make sense of something that didn't line up and that she couldn't otherwise explain. No one hired her for any of this. No one trained her to do it. She isn't a police officer, not a lawyer, not a medical examiner, not a data engineer. She is the mother of an 18-year-old named Nolan Wells, who left home on the 4th of July afternoon to spend time with friends and never came back. The story most people know about this case is a story about an island, a boat, a group of young friends, and a death with no clear answer. That story is real, and it deserves to be told, but it isn't the story this video is here to tell. This is the story about those 4 jobs, and why a mother in the middle of the worst grief of her life had to take all 4 of them on herself, instead of having a system that did it for her. Because if the answer is this family could pull off all 4 only because they had the attention of an entire nation behind them, the backing of nationally known attorneys, and funding from a former professional athlete, the next question, the one that actually matters, is this. What happens to everyone else? The families with no cameras pointed at them, no one calling to check in except themselves, no resources to fill in the gaps that a functioning system should have filled in the first place. That's the question this video is going to follow, one job at a time. In theory, a well-functioning society already has 4 systems in place to do this work for a grieving family. A search and rescue response fast enough so that no mother has to personally lobby for volunteers to go looking. A forensic process transparent enough that no family has to pay out of pocket for a second opinion. A justice system accessible enough that the right to know the truth doesn't require a law degree or the right connections. And a legal framework around digital data clear enough that recovering a deceased person's digital evidence doesn't turn into a months-long legal fight against 6 corporations at once. None of those 4 systems moved fast enough in the Nolan Wells case. Not because anyone deliberately obstructed anything, but in most respects, because the process themselves were already slow, already complicated, never built around the needs of a family in the middle of a panicked search for answers. And everywhere, those 4 systems stopped short. A mother stepped in. That's the question this video is going to follow, one job at a time. On July 4th, Nolan Wells, a freshman wide receiver for Southwest Mississippi Community College, took a boat with a group of friends out to Horn Island, a stretch of undeveloped barrier sand 10 miles from shore, with no bridge, no ferry, no way off except the boat that brought you there. A few hours later, that boat came back to the mainland. Nolan wasn't on it. Christine Wansley reported him missing around midnight. In theory, this is the moment when the responsibility for searching and for piecing together what happened shifts to the authorities. In practice, she was the one who reached out to the Mississippi chapter of the volunteer organization United Cajun Navy, because she felt the official response wasn't fast enough. It wasn't wide enough. A boat crew with a drone searched for most of a day before weather cut it short. The next day, a volunteer helicopter joined in. Eventually, it was a National Park Service ranger who found the body, 2 days after Nolan went missing. This is the first place in this story where a job that should have belonged to the system instead landed on the family, mobilizing enough search capacity fast enough to not miss the window that matters most. Not because law enforcement did nothing, but because in the family's experience, what was being done wasn't enough. And that gap only closed when a mother picked up the phone and called strangers herself. After the body was found, the family's work as amateur investigators didn't stop. It just changed shape, trying to reconstruct an afternoon that no one, not even the people who were there, described the same way twice. According to the friend's public account, they left Horn Island around 4:30 in the afternoon, and Nolan chose to stay behind. GPS data later collected by investigators in Jackson County shows the boat actually deported around 4:31, so close enough to match that account. But roughly half an hour earlier, at around 4 p.m., someone on the boat called Sea Tow, reporting that the bilge pump had failed, that they were taking on water, and confirming everyone aboard was safe. Meanwhile, witnesses told investigators they saw Nolan on the island as late as 6 p.m., an hour and a half after the boat, according to every source of data, had already left. No one knows for certain what filled that gap. It could be a witness misremembering the time, in the glare and noise of the beach crowded with dozens of other boats on that day. Human memory is never more slippery than it is under the sun and music. It could also be a sign that the simplest version of the story isn't the complete one. Both possibilities are sitting on the same investigator's desk, and after interviewing roughly 60 witnesses, no agency has publicly picked one over the other. There's also a factor that's entirely natural, unconnected to any person, and deserves to be weighed just as seriously. The waters around Horn Island have been described by an official from the very Cajun Navy chapter that took part in the search as home to dangerous rip currents. What he called washing machine currents, with a history of drownings that had nothing to do with anyone else's involvement. That's a real possibility, and it belongs on the table alongside every other theory. What matters here isn't who was right or wrong about what happened on the island. What matters is that reconstructing a timeline, cross-referencing a rescue call, a GPS ping, and a witness account is core investigative work. It isn't something a grieving family should have to do themselves while waiting for the rare update from the police. But Christine Wansley's own account, that's close to what happened. A text message sent introducing herself simply, "Hi, this is Christine Nolan's mom, just wanted to get an update," followed by a call back that offered almost nothing new. "We've heard from no one else," she has said. Sheriff John Ledbetter said in the earliest days that there was no indication of foul play. Weeks later, the district attorney's office said the investigation was far from over. Both statements can be true at once. An early cautious assessment and a more thorough process unfolding over time. But for a family waiting in between, the distance between those two statements stretched across weeks, with very little filling the space in between, is exactly the gap they had to stand in themselves, just to avoid feeling completely left behind. The state of Mississippi completed its official autopsy on July 7th, just one day after Nolan's body was recovered. That's a reasonable turnaround for forensic work, but its findings to this day still haven't been released. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McIlrath has explained that the report will remain sealed until it's presented to a grand jury, the standard procedure for every non-natural death in the county, not something specific to Nolan's case. As a matter of policy, that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. But it comes with no timeline a family can hold on to. It's simply a closed door with no countdown clock attached. Faced with that closed door, the family did something very few families are in a position to do. They paid for a second independent forensic pathologist, Dr. Roger A. Mitchell Jr., to conduct a second autopsy. According to attorney Ben Crump, the cost of that exam was covered by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. It's worth pausing on that detail, because it matters more than it might seem on the surface. Getting an independent autopsy credible enough for national media to report on it depends on a family having access to a large enough source of funding. In this case, that source was one of the most recognizable athletes in America. Not every grieving family knows someone like that. Not every death of a young person draws enough attention for a public figure to decide to step in and fund it. And even with that, exam completed, the results announced in late July still didn't bring the clarity the family had hoped for. Both the cause and the manner of death were listed as undetermined, pending further investigation. There was an area of red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head. It could represent natural decompositional changes after time spent in warm Gulf water. Or it could be consistent with blunt force trauma. Even the pathologist himself couldn't tell which, in part because the second exam took place after the body had already gone through the state's official autopsy, which meant he couldn't directly examine the airway or the stomach contents to establish a timeline. This is where the systemic question in this case gets sharpest. A family mobilized every rare resource available to them. A nationally known civil rights attorney, a famous funder, a credible forensic pathologist. And the final result was still undetermined. Not because their effort wasn't enough, because the technical limits of a second exam conducted after the first one are a limit that no amount of money can undo. That raises a harder question for any other family, anywhere, without access to support on this scale. If even every one of those resources, the medical truth is still murky, what chance does a family with no famous attorney, no funder, no camera pointed anywhere near them have of even reaching a fraction of that same clarity? The honest, practical answer is usually almost none. For most families, a sealed state autopsy means waiting in silence, with no backup plan, no one stepping forward to pay for a second expert, no reporter calling to ask for an update on their behalf. Transparency in that scenario isn't a default right. It's something that has to be bought, or advocated for loudly enough that someone else decides to buy it for you. There's a part of this story that plays out entirely inside courthouse paperwork, with no cinematic drama to it at all. And yet, it's one of the clearest illustrations of the systemic gap this script is about. On July 20th, Christine Wells Wansley filed a petition in Jackson County Chancery Court, asking to be appointed administrator of her son's estate. On its face, that's a standard probate step, but in the context of Nolan's still unexplained death, it carries something much more specific. It was the only legal door through which she could gain a standing to act on his behalf, including eventually the right to file a civil lawsuit if someone is ever found legally responsible. No lawsuit has been filed as of this recording. No specific individual has been named as a defendant in any court filing for causing Nolan's death. What needs to be understood here isn't that the family is accusing anyone in court. What needs to be understood is this: in order to have the standing to request that evidence to be preserved, in order to be formally heard by the legal system at all, a grieving mother had to learn within a matter of weeks how to operate a legal apparatus that most ordinary people never have to touch in their lives. That's the third job, not acting as someone else's attorney, but eventually becoming the one who has to initiate the entire legal process on behalf of her son, all while still in the earliest stage of grief. The Wells family has a major advantage here. They have Ben Crump, one of the most recognized civil rights attorneys in the country, someone who has represented families in similar cases before and knows exactly which legal levers to pull and when. For a family without access to an attorney of that level, for financial reasons, because they didn't know who to call, because their case wasn't prominent enough for a major law firm to take on pro bono. This is the first legal step. Simply gaining the standing to act on their child's behalf could have been an obstacle they never got past in the first place. This is the most complicated of the four jobs, and probably the one that most clearly exposes the gap between how fast technology has evolved and how slowly the traditional investigative system has adapted to it. When Nolan's phone was returned, his mother opened it hoping to find the images from July 4th, because according to people who knew him, Nolan was the kind of person who documented everything, posted everything. And yet there was nothing there. Not a single photo from that day. no video, not one trace on either of his 2 Snapchat accounts. She called that suspicious. She believes something was deleted. That's her account. And on its own, it isn't proof of anything. But what she did next is the more remarkable part. She didn't wait for police to handle the digital side of things. She did it herself. Before any formal legal request was ever filed, she had already used Life360, the same family location tracking app millions of other parents use, to trace her son's phone that day, and then compared it against the location data attached to his Snapchat activity. According to her, the 2 didn't match. Consider what that actually required. Someone with no technical background teaching herself, in the middle of grieving, how to pull and compare location data across 2 different platforms, because no agency was doing that work fast enough for her to feel comfortable simply waiting. That is quite literally the job of a digital forensic specialist, a role that exists within modern investigative agencies, but one that clearly hasn't been deployed quickly enough or transparently enough for this family to feel that they could just wait for it. The next step was moving from self-directed analysis to forcing the law to catch up. On July 20th, alongside the petition for state administration, the family laid the legal groundwork, and within that same filing, a follow-up request submitted in late July demanded records from 6 technology platforms: Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, all 3 owned by Meta, along with Snapchat, TikTok, and Life360. The request sought messages sent and received, photos and videos tied to those accounts, and GPS location data with timestamps. Each company was given 21 days to preserve and produce what was requested. It takes a bit of technical understanding to see why this matters more than it appears to on the surface. A phone, in a physical sense, is no longer where the truth actually lives. It's only where a copy of the truth briefly existed, before being kept or deleted. The far harder record to erase sits somewhere else, on the servers of the very companies we all use every day. When a message or a photo is deleted from a phone, it doesn't necessarily disappear from that company's servers right away. That depends entirely on each platform's own retention policy. Companies also retain metadata that never even shows up on the app itself. Login timestamps, device information, and critically for Life360 and for the location data embedded into Snapchat, a continuous log of where a phone actually was. But here's the crux of this 4th job. The process for actually accessing that data is nowhere near simple, fast, or free. It requires formal legal standing, a properly drafted petition, and a legal team with enough expertise to know exactly what to request from Meta, from Snapchat, from TikTok, from Life360. 4 systems, each with their own retention policy, its own legal department, its own response speed. Even with all of that in place, the 21-day window is only a starting point, not a guarantee of when the data will arrive or how complete it will be. It's entirely possible that some of what the family is looking for was never retained in the first place. In other words, even after completing the first 3 jobs, investigator, private forensic client, estate attorney, the family still had to learn an entirely new language. The language of corporate data retention policy, of civil subpoenas, of the federal privacy statutes that govern technology platforms. This is a field where even experienced attorneys often need specialized expertise to handle well, and it's being handled on the front line by a mother who 3 weeks earlier had never imagined she would need to learn any of it. There's something worth noting about the specific legal path the family had to take. This is a civil subpoena tied to a probate filing, not a criminal subpoena issued by a prosecutor. If this were a criminal investigation with an identified suspect, the prosecutor's office could request data from these platforms directly, typically with more speed and fewer obstacles than a private family faces. But because Nolan's death hasn't been classified as a homicide, that criminal path hasn't opened up, the family is left with only one option: the civil route. Slower, more expensive, and entirely dependent on whether they have the legal standing and the legal team to pursue it. That's the exact gap between the criminal and the civil systems, where an ordinary family with no one to guide them can easily get stuck. Right down the middle, not knowing on which door to knock on first. Now, put all 4 jobs side by side and ask a direct question. What allowed the Wells family to complete all 4 when most other families in similar circumstances almost certainly would not have been able to? The answer isn't Christine Wansley's own resilience alone, though that's real and it deserves to be recognized. The answer lies in a chain of outside factors that not every family has access to. A nationally influential civil rights attorney agreeing to take on the case, a public figure agreeing to fund an independent autopsy, the attention of major news outlets, driven in part by the racial dimensions of the case. Nolan was the only Black member in the group and didn't come back from that trip, which pulled the family story into a larger national conversation about race in America. And in doing so, drew a level of attention that very few deaths of 18-year-olds ever receive. Now, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with a family using every resource available to find answers about their child's death. Any parent would do the same given the chance. The issue isn't what the Wells family did. The issue is this: under the current system, whether a family can access the truth about their child's death depends far too heavily on whether that family can generate enough public pressure, enough connections, enough money, instead of being guaranteed as a baseline, regardless of who that family is. Try imagining a different version of the story. Another 18-year-old in another town dies under circumstances just as murky. Also a trip with friends, also an unexplained gap in time. Also a state autopsy sealed pending a grand jury. But that family doesn't know anyone who can introduce them to a prominent civil rights attorney. No public figure steps forward to fund an independent exam. No national outlet sends a reporter. In that version, the parents of that young man face exactly the same gaps the Wells family faced. A sealed autopsy with no timeline. A phone empty of data. A group of friends whose accounts don't fully line up, but without a single one of the 4 tools the Wells family had to fill in those gaps. In all likelihood, in that version, that story never makes it past a shortened local news brief. The autopsy stays sealed, possibly for months, possibly never fully released. The empty phone remains a mystery. No one has the resources to pursue. And that family has to learn to live with an unanswered question, not because they suffered any less or deserved answers any less, but simply because their story didn't carry enough media weight to force the system to move any faster. This is the core gap that the Nolan Wells case exposes more clearly than almost any other recent case. The system that handles unclear deaths of young people at a national scale isn't designed to automatically deliver transparency to every family equally. It responds most strongly to cases that generate enough noise and stays quietest, slowest, and hardest to move for cases where no one steps in to amplify the family's voice. In other words, justice in a lot of real-world cases isn't something distributed by default. It's something that has to be fought for, and the ability to fight for it successfully is, in turn, distributed unevenly along the exact same lines of inequality that already exists. Who has the money? Who has connections? Who has a story newsworthy enough for the media to want to tell? This shouldn't be read as criticism on the specific individuals who helped the Wells family. It isn't a fault of any attorney for taking a case. It isn't the fault of any athlete for choosing to fund an exam. The problem sits at a much higher level. A society where whether a family gets access to the truth depends largely on someone outside the official system choosing to step in and help, instead of depending on whether the system is doing its own job correctly in the first place. There's one image that keeps returning throughout this case. A phone handed back to the mother, fully charged, working perfectly, empty on the one day she needed it to speak. That image should now be understood alongside the 4 jobs she had to take on in the 3 weeks that followed. Not because she wanted to be an investigator, a lawyer, or a digital forensics analyst, but because every time she waited for the system to do that work for her, the silence lasted long enough that she felt she had no choice but to step into the gap herself. No one, anywhere on the public record on this case, has been proven to have lied. No one has been charged. The only thing that's been established with certainty is this: an 18-year-old boy stepped onto a boat on a holiday afternoon and never came home. And 3 weeks later, his mother is still single-handedly running 4 roles that, in a better organized society, should have belonged to 4 separate systems, moving fast enough, transparently enough, that no family would ever have to fill that gap themselves. The question this case leaves behind, then, isn't only a question for this family. It's a question for anyone following this story from a distance. If even a family with a famous attorney, a well-known funder, and the attention of an entire country still had to perform 4 unpaid jobs just to find answers about their own son's death, what about the families that have none of that? The ones out there right now with nothing? Perhaps the most honest answer is most of them can't do any of it. They simply wait. And that wait, unlike Christine Wansley's, will never be the subject of a story like this one. This case is still open. No cause of death has been released, no charges have been filed, and somewhere 6 technology companies are still sitting on 21-day clocks that haven't run out. We'll be following this story as it develops. The grand jury, the subpoena responses, whatever comes next for this family. If this investigation gave you something to think about, not just about Nolan Wells, but about what it would take for your own family to get answers in a moment like this, that's exactly the kind of case we dig into here. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update when the next piece of this story surfaces. And if you have any thoughts on where the real accountability in a case like this should sit, with the investigators, with the platforms, with the process itself, leave them in the comments. Some of the sharpest angles on this channel have started as a comment on a video just like this one. We'll see you in the next investigation.